Namaste and welcome to another episode of the IIM Bangalore Podcast, where we celebrate ideas, leadership journeys, and the visionaries shaping institutions and industry. Today, we are deeply honored to host a leader who has profoundly influenced the trajectory of management education in India, Professor Rishikesha T Krishnan. Professor Krishnan is a professor of strategy at IIM Bangalore and served as the director of IIMB from 2020 to 2025. During his tenure, IIMB achieved new heights in global rankings, expanded research and innovation capacity, strengthened digital learning initiatives, and continued to champion diversity and societal impact. Before that, he also served as director of IIM Indore, guiding it towards global accreditations and academic excellence. Apart from all of this, he is a distinguished scholar in innovation and strategy, with acclaimed books including From Jugaad to Systematic Innovation and 8 Steps to Innovation. Sir has also contributed widely to national innovation policy, higher education reform, and technology leadership in India. Professor Krishnan, thank you so much for joining us over here today. It is a pleasure to have you with us over here.
Yeah, my pleasure. Really happy to be with you.
Thank you so much once again, sir, for joining us. So now, let's begin our podcast with looking at where it all started, which leads us to our first segment, leadership and institutional vision. My very first question to you, sir, is you've led IIMB through transformation. When you took over as director in July 2020, higher education was facing unprecedented disruption from the pandemic to rapid digital acceleration. So how exactly did you define your leadership priorities during that phase? And what core principles guided your decisions here at IIM Bangalore?
So during COVID, our main priority was to make sure that students are not disrupted and that their education programs end on time and with the quality that IIMB is very well known for. So we had made a very rapid transition to online learning, and that was possible because we had experience in online learning earlier. One of the things we took away from COVID, however, is that there is tremendous scope for online learning in general. And therefore, we focused quite a bit on expanding our online learning portfolio after COVID. And one of the important things we have done is launched a whole series of certificate programs on our online platform, which is IIMBX. So we have a professional certificate in hospital management, we have an AI for managers program, and recently we started a professional certificate for airline management as well. So a lot of this was already there in terms of capability, but the impetus to launch and scale was, I think, driven by COVID. The other thing we also realized thanks to COVID is that our pedagogy and our engagement, even in our regular programs, needs to undergo some change. So we have looked at how can we integrate some aspects of online learning even into the MBA program. So we have a few courses where there's online supplements, where there's online preparation before they come into the main class, for example, in accounting. So a lot of these things, I think, have been driven by COVID. But of course, we also realize that, there is a much wider canvas out there. And 2020, while it was the year of COVID, was also the year of the national education policy. And we therefore felt that we should use the vision of the national education policy to widen our offerings. And that's why we have also launched a new bachelor's program, which will be starting in 2026, but the admission process has already started. And we started an online BBA program in 2024, which is again reaching out to a large number of learners. So I think COVID has played a role, but it's also partly our strong desire to enhance our impact on the broader educational canvas of India.
Thank you so much for that, sir. I think it really makes sense from the perspective of sure, COVID did make you change and expand, but apart from that as well, you looked at the NEP and did a lot of initiatives that now we're seeing unfolding, like you mentioned, the new UG program or the BBA program. So, sir, along those lines, because we are talking about culture and sort of initiatives you've taken at IIM Bangalore, my second question to you, sir, is on terms of building the IIM Bangalore culture and the long-term impact. IIMB, as we know, is not only known for academic excellence, but for a culture of intellectual rigor, ethical leadership, and societal responsibility. So how exactly would you define or describe the IIMB DNA? And which initiatives from your tenure do you believe will shape the institution over the next decade?
I think the IIMB DNA has a few core characteristics. One of them is we are very responsive to what is happening around us. If you look at the history of IIMB, we have been the pioneers in many new academic programs. We have also pioneered in terms of some executive education offerings, and we've also been one of the early leaders in research. So one aspect of our DNA has certainly been the ability, to understand what's happening in the environment and to quickly come up with appropriate offerings and new initiatives to address those different opportunities. The second dimension of our culture, our DNA has been that we like to have a mix of different ideas which will blend together very well for maximum impact. Just to give you an example, there are some institutes which are only fixed on the case method and they say that's the only best way of education. But we don't think so. We think the case method has its place. Sometimes simulations and other methods might be better. Sometimes you need to do learning out there in the field, like maybe when you go on the Himalayan program. So we certainly believe that there are different ways students learn, and we need to provide them those different opportunities which will enable them to learn in those different ways. The third dimension I think you already talked about, which is our strong focus on diversity and inclusion. IIMB was the first institute among the IIMs and one of the first institutes in the country to have a really supportive environment for students with disability. That was many years back, and we have built on that even further now. So in fact, many students with disability prefer to come to IIMB rather than go to any other institution. So this is another thing which has got strongly embedded in our institution. But the common thread running across all of these is excellence, doing the best in whatever we are doing, stretching ourselves to make sure that we are constantly doing better. I think that's something which runs across all these dimensions that I spoke about.
Thank you so much for your answer, sir. And I think, yes, as a current student at IIM Bangalore, we can all attest that our curriculum is filled with innovative and unique ways of learning. Let's now move on to our second segment on strategy, innovation, and India's growth story. Your work, that is from Jugaad to systematic innovation, has significantly influenced how India thinks in terms of innovation, which is basically about moving from improvisation to scalable systems. So where exactly do you think India stands today on this journey? And what change, maybe in industry, policy, or academia, must be made to unlock innovation at scale?
Yeah, India has done well, but I think also we need to move a bit faster. If you just look back over the last 30 years or so since economic liberalization started, we have certainly seen that innovation capabilities have improved. Many companies have become globally competitive. Digital technologies are getting diffused across the industry. But if you look at the cutting edge of some of the most technologically intensive industries, you look at something like semiconductors, you look at new materials, you look at other industries where technology is changing very fast. I think we have a lot of work to do to being at the forefront of those industries. And that's perhaps the biggest challenge going forward. I mean, we do quite well in a lot of service businesses. We do very well in automobile industry, pharmaceuticals, but probably not as well in things like semiconductors, new materials, and so on. So that's the new next frontier, if you like. And that's what the government is also focusing on. But there's a lot of capability building which has to happen ground up if we are really going to fulfill that potential or promise which we have.
Thank you for that, sir. And I think you brought up a very brilliant point, which sort of ties to my next question. So you mentioned that, yes, India is doing very well in certain industries with investment in tech and a lot of other things. But there are a few areas, a few capabilities or a few sectors that we need to invest more in if we truly want to grow. So which sectors or capabilities do you think, you briefly touched upon it, but you believe will define India's innovation leadership over the next decade if you had to name a few, maybe capabilities and then industries?
So broadly, it's high-tech manufacturing. As you know, India has done very well in services. And of course, we need to sustain our leadership there. But I think that is something, or services companies, particularly IT services and so on. I think they are working on it. But there is what would be called advanced manufacturing or high-tech manufacturing. And that could include industries like aerospace, of course, semiconductors, nanomaterials, whole lot to do with AI and everything to do with AI. All of these, I think, are in a way work in progress. There's quantum computing. Sorry, I forgot that. Correct. So these are the areas which are now moving very rapidly, and we need to make sure we don't miss the bus.
Right. Got it, sir. And since you work so closely on many national projects and you've particularly looked at this area of strategy, innovation, technology, I think from a policy and institutional lens, what do you think are the most critical levers India must invest in to strengthen, say, research, technology commercialization, and just being competitive globally?
See, it's a challenging issue. There are two main dimensions to it. One is that there's a basic issue of skills. And a lot of that has to do with our education system and the associated skilling ecosystem. I gave you the example of semiconductors. Now, today, if India has to rapidly expand in semiconductors, we don't have qualified people who could fill those positions in the semiconductor industry. So now we are being forced to very rapidly put in place training programs to get the folks trained rapidly to meet that requirement. So skilling and education is definitely one part of it. The second part, which is not always recognized as clearly, is we need companies which have very strong internal processes that will help them innovate on a sustained basis. What I mean by that is you need companies which are willing to experiment, where employees are not scared of failure, where the company leadership has the confidence to drive innovation in new and emerging areas, where often things won't work. So you will have to keep trying out things. And I mean, you just look at the kind of stuff some of the top AI companies are doing, for example.
Yes.
It's changing so fast, and the leadership in the AI industry, even globally, is changing almost every few months. Okay. So if you want to compete in that, you need a very strong innovation capability embedded in your organization. And to me, it appears that we haven't yet created those organizations. It's partly a leadership issue, but it's also partly the organizational structure, the systems, the incentives, performance measurement, the culture. You really need to create a very vibrant culture. I mean, we often talk about Silicon Valley and the characteristics which firms in Silicon Valley have. I'm not sure we've been able to replicate that so far, particularly in areas where tech is changing very fast. So that to me is a critical ability, and we need folks who can manage that.
I think you brought up a very valid point, sir, about how exactly companies need to evolve and have a more flexible mindset if really we need to reach a level of global competitiveness. And I think right now, technology, AI, these are a few buzzwords that everybody is hearing and discussing, which leads us to the next segment that I'm sure a lot of people are very curious about, the future of management education in India. So right now, AI, technology, these are buzzwords, and we've been seeing so many changes in the last 2 or 3 years itself. So how exactly do you see management education evolving, and how do you think Indian B schools could perhaps prepare themselves to be globally relevant and sort of prepare leaders who are tech-enabled in the future?
So we have to recognize some trends. One of the trends we need to recognize is that globally, management education is on a slow decline. The demand for MBA programs, for example, in the US and some of the other developed economies is showing a declining trend. However, to my mind, it appears that India could buck that if we do certain things. The reason I'm saying that is, number one, because we have a fairly high growth trajectory that we hope to maintain over the next 20-25 years. If you just look at the government's plans for Vikasit Bharat, that involves something like 8 to 9% growth over an extended period of time, next 20 years at least. Now, if you're going to achieve that kind of growth, that means you need to start a lot of new companies, Plus, existing companies will also have to grow very rapidly, and you will need people to manage those companies. So, I think the requirement for MBAs in India will continue to be strong as long as the India growth story remains intact. That's number one. But there's a number 2 point. The number 2 point is that you can't take this for granted. This will also mean that the MBA program has to be agile and adaptive. What does that mean? Look at, for example, the way technology is now infusing almost all businesses. So the MBA of today and tomorrow needs to be fairly technology savvy. And if that person doesn't have that capability from their prior education, we need to make sure they get it while they are MBA students here. Even in the US, for example, the so-called tech MBA, which is a fusion of technology and business, is doing much better than the plain vanilla MBA program. And I think there's a lesson for us to learn here. We have the potential for high growth, and we have policies and aspirations to move in that direction. If our MBA programs can not only impart the traditional components of MBA education like finance, marketing, HR, and so on, but also make sure this is well integrated with the emerging tech, then I think we'll have a very powerful proposition to offer to students and to the country as a whole. So my sort of conclusion is that MBA education has a bright future in India as long as our programs also adapt to the requirements of what's happening outside.
Thank you for that, sir. I think, yes, in terms of programs evolving, sure, you mentioned a very good point. But from a student perspective, my question to you is, what exactly do you think are the capabilities, or if, let's say, the capabilities are provided by the programs themselves, sort of the mindset or things students should do to make sure they're also adept and continue to succeed in this era where technology is so volatile and AI has come into play?
Sure. So when we talk to folks in the industry, they are clear that students need to have many of the traditional capabilities that an MBA student had, which means good analytical skills, good communication skills, strong ethics, basically good leadership. I mean, many of the things that have always been part of MBA programs. However, the industry folks are also clear that you need to have a few other things. You need to have a good understanding of digital technology, you need to have an understanding of data, and you need to have a sensitivity to ESG. So the best of the old along with what is emerging, and of course knowledge of the different functions, whether it be finance, marketing, etc. So students, I think, have to be adept at imbibing this rather broad portfolio of skills and abilities if they want to be successful. And the other dimension which I think is very important today is that they need to be able to think for themselves as well as use AI tools effectively. These are not substitutes for each other. You have to be able to think, analyze, get fresh insights, maybe be very entrepreneurial. All of these have to come from you. And then, of course, you need to use AI tools where required to enhance your productivity, to solve certain problems in less time. So basically, what seems to me the biggest challenge for students is they shouldn't believe that they can sort of just outsource their thinking to AI. I don't think that's going to work.
Yes, I think the key takeaway based on what you said is sure, leverage the tools we have, leverage AI, use it, but let it not be a substitute for thinking as a whole. Rather, use it as a complement rather than a substitute.
Absolutely.
And I think that is perhaps a great nugget of wisdom we got from you. And I think there's a lot all of us can learn from you. And that's why we want to look a little bit back at your journey.
Sure.
So you've studied at extremely prestigious institutions. You've led 2 IIMs. You've advised national institutions. You've done a lot of work on strategy and innovation. So looking back, I just wanted to know, are there any formative experiences, this could be during your education or your tenure at the institutions, that actually you believe like shaped your idea in terms of leadership, that you wanted to lead in a particular way or decision making?
Well, I've been involved in various kinds of organizational and what might be called leadership roles right since my young days, right from my school days. But the time I really got exposure, and I think I stretched and enhanced my leadership capabilities, was in IIT Kanpur, where I was the cultural secretary of the Students' Gymkhana. I was involved in a lot of student activities. I interacted a lot with professors, with a whole lot of visitors, of course, with my fellow students. So I think that was the time I really learned a lot in terms of foundational abilities of leadership. The second opportunity I got was very young. I was in the position where I worked in my father's company. So this was when I was in my early 20s, and my father was running what would today be called a deep tech company. So he was an entrepreneur very far ahead of his times, and I worked with him and helped him for a few years in growing his business. That again was an amazing learning experience, because a lot of our work was with the government, so I got to understand how the government works firsthand. We had to be very good on quality because we were competing with imported products. My father himself was a person who was pushing the bar as far as performance of his products were concerned, and he in fact designed with his team all the products that we sold. So I got a lot of exposure at a very young age. I think these experiences really helped me. In fact, even today, or even when I was the director of two IIMs, some of the things I learned when I was working with my dad on things like taxation or government policy, many of those things came in handy even 2 3 decades later when I was working as a director. So yeah, I think all those things certainly played a role.
Thank you so much for this, sir. It's really nice to learn about your journey and your
Sure.
experiences. And I think through the podcast, we've sort of looked at different areas when it comes to, say, AI at the moment, management education, and then your personal journey. And I think to close off the podcast, we have a few rapid fire
Sure.
style questions that we just wanted to know your opinion on. So, our first question to you would be, what is one book you feel like every management student should read?
Well, one book, I was very impressed by this book called Built to Last. It was one of the first management classics. It's a very old book, but it sort of brought out the difference between companies that are really long lasting and successful compared to those which don't really survive for too long.
Thank you for that suggestion, sir. We'll put it on our reading list. My next question would be, what is one leadership principle you would never compromise on?
I think uphold the dignity of people, all the people you work with. That's the single and probably the most important people management principle you need to keep in mind.
Thank you, sir. And apart from AI, which we are discussing a lot, do you think there's any other innovation trend that students should track closely at the moment?
Most of the other trends are in a way connected. I mean, if you take something like quantum computing, it is expected that it will really exponentially increase the power of computing, which again will have impacts for AI and many other things. So, in general, what we see is an increase in the pace of change, an increase in the power of things, the tools becoming more sophisticated. So, students, I guess, really need to keep track of these, but not forget what I told you earlier, that all of these are one way or another. These are all aids or support to human ingenuity. So you should treasure and protect your own ingenuity and creativity at any cost.
Got it, sir. And our last question would be, since most of us in our MBA journey are in our 20s or early 30s, what is one piece of advice you would give yourself if you could go back in, say, your 20s?
The main advice I would give myself is value experience over money. And what I mean by that is, I'm not saying that you should be take sannyas and not worry about financial rewards. But I think when you're young is really the time to have diverse experiences, to learn from very interesting people you work with. A lot of your work habits get shaped by your early bosses and peers. And all those experiences come in handy later. You can't just very easily estimate what will be the value of an experience when you're going through it. So I would just say that don't be scared of taking unorthodox paths, learn from diverse situations, pursue different adventures, and lead a kind of full life, and don't get driven by financial rewards alone. If you're an MBA from the top school, financial rewards will come your way anyway. And at the end of the day, it doesn't matter too much, whether somebody else earns, few lakhs more than you. I don't think it really matters so much in the long run.
Well said, sir. And I think you spoke about valuing experiences. Well, one thing is certain, we really value the time you gave us here today. So thank you so much for joining us and for all your insights. And to everybody else, thank you so much for tuning in. We hope to see you again, and we hope that this episode brought some wisdom or some knowledge you could take back with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Riddhi.
Thank you, sir.